Hello and welcome to episode 404 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien Fay and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm good, Andy. I'm going to only mention Rubik's Cubes for the final time on this podcast because I managed to solve the Rubik's Cube in under a minute, which was my ultimate goal. I know you've been able to do it, Andy, but I actually got there and managed to do it in under a minute. It's about trying to repeat that feat in the future. But interestingly, moving on from that, this week's been, you've pretty much going to have to be like ignoring any sort of internet online articles because AI is the big thing that everybody seems to be talking about, artificial intelligence, how it's going to destroy life as we know it. But while I jest, I'm really talking about how it'll impact different businesses and stuff online and even entities like us. So that has been something we've been looking at, and there's been a lot of stuff online about it because obviously Google's launched their AI search functionality off the back of Microsoft launching their AI search via Bing, and Google's was obviously met with a lot of negativity because their AI gave a wrong answer in a demonstration that they gave, and it wiped, I don't know how many 100 billion off the share price. So it's been something that's been a focal point for a lot of industries because lots of people listen to this podcast. AI is going to have a huge impact on their job, but also the way they interact with things going forward. And actually, I'm more than likely in the coming weeks, because it gives an opportunity to do an investment piece based around AI and how you can actually ride that trend to try and invest and make money. So that's something to bear in mind. It's an idea I'm playing with for 80/20 investor members, so I could give some small insights on the podcast. So it's been an interesting time actually this last week. So something to bear in mind. And if anybody has any thoughts about all of this and its impact on the world of money, then feel free to put them into our community. So I'm going to move on to what's on this week's show, Andy. And I'm going to be doing two pieces and you're going to be doing the third. The first piece I'm going to look at is to do with currencies, and in particular where currencies might be headed, because that's a massive impact on our lives, whether it's us going on holiday or on investments. And I'll flesh that out when I do that piece, but there's something interesting in there, especially if you like fast food. I'm then going to do something because it is Valentine's Day this week. So it's not that I'm a particular romantic. If my wife listened to this podcast, she'd be the first person who'd be shocked that I'm doing something related to Valentine's Day, but it's to do with scams. So something called romance scams. There's been a number of banks that have issued warnings about romance scams, and actually it's quite sad when you see the numbers involved in terms of victims, but also in the amounts of money that people are losing as a result of these scams. And Andy, your piece is going to be?
I'm going to be covering a piece on online banking and particularly online banking apps, which the Consumer website and magazine did an interesting piece of research where they looked into depth at the security of these banking apps, and they ranked them from 1 to 10 and also gave just a little bit of insight around that. And I'm going to give a couple of extra tips on how people can stay safe by banking online. So that'll be at the end of the podcast. Right, so Damien, let's start with the first piece then, and it's to do with currencies. And you mentioned takeaways as well. I don't know where this is going, but I'm all ears.
Yeah, so one of the things that everybody is impacted by are currency movements, whether you know it or not. So if you go on holiday, then you are directly going to be impacted by currency movements. So the strength or weakness of the pound versus the currency where you're holidaying. If you are just living in this country and you don't go abroad, then it does impact inflation, because obviously if the UK pound is weak against other currencies, then we have to pay more pounds to be able to buy products from abroad. It starts to fuel inflation. But also, if you've been listening to the market updates that I do, so I've done a market update for February just a few days ago, then I talked about the dollar index. So that is a measure of the strength of the dollar against a basket of currencies, and it has a huge impact on investment markets generally. So where bonds, equities, different asset classes, including commodities and gold, where they go going forward. So whether you realise it or not, currencies have a big impact not only on your enjoyment of life, that's holidays, but also on your wealth. So people ask me sometimes about currency moves and what's going to happen to the currency, particularly in investing, because it does have such a massive impact. If I look at some of the funds in my own 50k portfolio that I run on 80/20 Investor, there has been a huge move in the pound versus the dollar since late autumn last year, and that has had a big impact on certain funds, some to the positive, some to the detriment of their performance. And of course, if you get those currencies moves right, it can be a nice kicker to your portfolio. But I do not know what's going to happen with currency moves, so don't ask me. No one really does. That's speculation. And of course, currency moves can be quite wild, and if you get caught on the wrong side, then you will be licking your wounds financially. So what I wanted to do was take a slightly different angle on this about currencies. And I remember I went on holiday last year. I was in America with my family, and I came back, and Andy will tell you, all I did was moan about the price of things out there. Now, I know what the exchange rate is between the pound and the US dollar, but when I was going to do the supermarket shopping, because we stayed in a villa, so I wasn't eating out, we didn't really eat out that much because of the cost. I was going down and buying things that I would probably buy in the UK. So let's take example. I kept moaning about the cost of a baguette, right? So in a baguette in the UK, you could probably get that at that point for about £1, £1.50. If you went to a supermarket in the UK, I was paying about $3 or up to $3 in a supermarket in the US. And of course, that comparison of two products that were fairly similar, they weren't identical, was showing that even when you did the exchange rate, then given the exchange rate that I was paying at that time, I would expect the baguette still to be costing me less than $2, but it wasn't. It was costing me $3. So when I worked it back, I was like, not only is the exchange rate poor, but everything seems really expensive when you try and compare like for like products. So this actually leads nicely into what I'm about to talk about, this comparison of what things should really cost when you look at two items, and that's actually known as purchasing power parity. So it's PPP. It's a theory that all currencies should head towards a rate so that the prices of a basket of goods and services should be the same. In other words, if you go and buy the same thing in two different places, then the currencies, if you believe this theory, should move towards a rate that effectively the cost of these two things is identical. So if I'm paying £1.50 for a baguette over here, then I'm paying effectively £1.50 for a baguette in the US. Now, the problem is no two products are really alike, but there are variances around the world in almost anything you would look at, whether it's food that you buy in the supermarket or services that you buy within the economy. Back in 1986, The Economist came up with this idea that was meant to be a fairly light-hearted way of looking at this concept, and they created the Big Mac Index. Now, the Big Mac is, as you know, available all around the world. So if you go to different countries, the Big Mac is the Big Mac, and you can buy that product wherever you go on holiday, and most people will end up finding one if they have a love of Big Mac in the UK. Now, the theory is that obviously the cost of that Big Mac should be comparable in each country that you go to. So if a Big Mac costs a few pounds in this country, then if you go to America, the equivalent price should be paid in US dollars. But of course, what you find is that isn't the case. And over the years, it was a light-hearted take on this, but it has been quoted in lots of different textbooks and has become a global standard for this idea of purchasing power parity, this PPP. So The Economist even did different versions. They did a GDP adjusted version of the Big Mac Index. So that was trying to take into account that if you had a country that was, say, like a developing nation that had a low GDP, then the price of a Big Mac should be lower in that economy. So they've done different variations of it. What it means is that the Big Mac Index can be quite useful in seeing, well, where might currencies move to? Where should they be if we take the Big Mac as a standard? And The Economist has recently updated all the data. And if you go and look at their website, you can play around with their data. Now, they always look at it in terms of dollars, but you can, if you play around with it, get it as the base currency being the British pound, and then look at where other currencies should be. So I've done that. I'm going to put a link in the show notes in case you want to, but I want to give people the highlights of this. So I'm going to take the US as my first example. Now, in Britain, a Big Mac, based on what they're saying, costs £3.79. In the US, it costs $5.36. Now, given that their Big Mac is the same product, if there was a parity there, then the exchange rate for the pound to the US dollar should be $1.41 for every pound. At the moment, it's about $1.23-ish, somewhere like that. That's when this research was carried out, but actually it's a bit below that. It's around about $1.20 for every pound. So interestingly, I'd been to America in the past, a few years ago, to celebrate a big birthday of mine, and about $1.40 was where the pound was at that point, and things didn't seem expensive as when I went last year. So, taking away from that, what that means is that if the pound dollar exchange rate was going to be fair value, then we would expect the pound to dollar exchange rate to move from around $1.20 back up to $1.41. And interestingly, that was up around the level it was just before Brexit, and then it collapsed. So that has implications, if it did happen, not saying it would, for investing, because obviously if the pound rallies against the dollar, then that is detrimental to assets that you hold in dollars when they're converted back to pounds. It tends to be a headwind for the FTSE 100, but of course you don't know that's going to happen. It does also mean that it shows that when you're looking for a holiday at the moment, and there's a list here, I'm going to run through some of them, which therefore give you indications of what would be an expensive place to go on holiday versus a cheaper place to go on holiday. It can give you insights into that as well. So I've just said that example there. What about Europe? Actually, in Europe, so we're taking the whole euro area, again, a Big Mac is £3.79 in Britain, according to their research. It'd be €4.86. Now, the implied exchange rate is 1.28 euros to every pound. Well, at the moment, that is 1.13. So it shows you there is an overvaluation of the euro versus the pound of 13.2%. So again, it just shows you how expensive it is to holiday in Europe. And if you do go there, you'll come back doing what I did, just moan about the cost of a Big Mac or a baguette or whatever it is you're buying compared to the UK. So we'll put a link through to the article so you can have a look at the data and play around with it. But places that would be very expensive based upon this to go on holiday are Switzerland, that's the most expensive, Uruguay, Norway, Sweden. Other places I'll throw out there are Australia, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. And then when we start getting down to places that are more near parity, you've got places like Chile, and then you've got Canada. Now, if we move into places where the pound is overvalued versus those domestic currencies, then an interesting one is actually Hong Kong. Because if you go to Hong Kong, a Big Mac would cost in the UK £3.79. It would cost 21 Hong Kong dollars. That implies the exchange rate is 5.54 Hong Kong dollars for every pound. What the actual exchange rate you get, so if you were going to go to Hong Kong, you get 9.64 Hong Kong dollars for every pound. Of course, this is based on the research at the time they did this at the beginning of this year, and the exchange rates have changed. But it means that the Hong Kong dollar is about 40% undervalued versus the British pound. So if you're going to go on holiday, you want to start heading east. Other countries where the pound is massively overvalued versus that domestic currency is India, Indonesia, Taiwan, the Philippines, and South Africa. So they are all countries where if you went there, you'd be sitting there thinking, blimey, it is cheap to buy things out here when you're on holiday. Other countries include Japan, Vietnam, and even China. So while I can't tell you what's going to happen to currencies, if you believe this theory that the currency should go towards this mean to make something like the Big Mac an equivalent price in each currency, then it suggests that certain currencies are going to move up and down quite considerably versus the other, which will have a big impact on how your holiday will feel if you go away, but also how the currency moves could, if they occur, and we start to go back towards the mean reversion, if you will, how it could start to impact your investments.
Okay, so the next piece then, Valentine's Day is coming up, and we're going to tie this in with a piece for the podcast. Damien, you've said you're not a romantic, but you're going to cover something about romance scams and what to be careful of.
Yeah, I mean, I have to caveat that. I'm told I'm not a romantic, which is slightly different. My wife, I'm not. I mean, it's just the way I'm built, unfortunately. I just never have been. We always laugh at my wife. She tells me, I wish you were more romantic. But we've been together for 20 years, so I never was. I'm not quite sure how I can change. But romance scams are something that apparently impact a lot of people. In fact, Action Fraud believe that £95 million a year is lost to romance scams. Now, depending on the stats that you look at, if you look at the numbers that Lloyd's recently put out, they think the number of victims has increased by 30% in the last year. So what is a romance scam? Well, it is a scam that usually originates online. So it could be via a dating app or social media that ultimately leads you to give money to somebody you've never met after building a relationship with them online, and it actually turns out to be a fake and a complete sham. So one example that was given in the press this week, because the banks have been warning about them, of a lady who joined a Facebook group talking about films. Then somebody in that group messaged them privately, and then that conversation moved onto Messenger because they were encouraged to do so. They were chatting for periods of time. They eventually were encouraged to put that messaging onto WhatsApp. They were then talking more about their private lives and sharing photos about their families. And they actually got to obviously know each other. And then the person was sharing pictures of them. And the ultimate scammer, because you know where this is going, was showing pictures of themselves and supposedly their daughter and places they were going. And they even had phone calls, but never video phone calls, interestingly. But they had phone calls and everything. And this person, obviously, they're starting to build a relationship, although it's online, and hence the romance equation of it. But then eventually, it got to a point where the scammer had an instance where their bank account had been frozen and they asked if they could have a small amount of money, but only small amounts like a gift card or something, just to tide them over. They'd sent through pictures of their bank statements and everything to make it seem 100% legitimate. And then eventually, in this case, the daughter became ill, needed an operation, but the scammer was away with their employer. I think they actually said they were a doctor that was helping out overseas in I think it was Syria or something, couldn't pay the medical bills. You see where this is going. And in the end, they were going to send the money, but it wasn't until a family member questioned it that the scam was obviously exposed. They'd already lost money, but it could have been much worse. Now, the point is that these scams, they can impact everybody because it's not about how smart you are. It's about you having a relationship you've built with somebody you think you know. And the only thing you might not have done, I mean, there'll probably be cases where they have actually met the person, but yeah, normally you haven't met them or not seen video calls. They are red flags. But there will be cases out there where a person maybe has met somebody, but they're not necessarily telling the truth. In an example that Lloyds gave, one pensioner lost £14,500 to a scam, which obviously is a lot of money. And it's not something, I don't want people listening to this thinking it's a female problem that are getting sort of all romantic. In fact, when they looked at the data, 53% of the victims are actually men. Now that's increased. If you go back a few years ago, the majority of people who were victims were women, but now it's more likely to be men who are victims of this kind of scam. And the average amount that they're being scammed is about £8,234. I like what I said about. It was actually a very precise figure that it was given by one of the banks. And the group that's most likely to be impacted, which I think is important, is the age group between 65 and 74. And they are actually more likely to send an average of about £12,000 to the scammers. So the message is, even though you might not think you'd fall foul of this type of scam, there are very smart people who are very financially literate. But when it comes to being able to give money, if you think about this, everybody has probably lent money to a friend or somebody they know and they've never got it back or something like that. It's playing on that emotional part, and particularly with something you think you're building a relationship romantically. But the important point that I want to highlight is that this could be impacting people in your life and you are not aware. So it could be your parents, could be your grandparents, could be your children. So you want to keep an eye out when they're talking about conversations about people that they've met, that they aren't therefore sending money, or if they start to help people, it will start off small and then it tends to progress based upon the information that the banks have released this week. Typical examples, the person and the scammer might be in the military, which is why they are sometimes in different countries, not being able to meet. And the reason that they suddenly need your financial help because they can't solve a problem they have maybe at home. They may be working on oil rigs. And another unfortunate version of this romance scam can be where they get people to send intimate photos and they then start blackmailing them. So that's going even further. So the message is, keep an eye out for romance scams. This isn't some niche thing that's occurring. Both Lloyds and Nationwide put out warnings this week to tie it in with the whole Valentine's thing like we have on the podcast this week. I mean, protect yourself as best you can, which is obviously don't share your bank details or other personal details with somebody. Just be cautious. If people are avoiding in-person meetings and video chats, this is some of the things that people say online to try and protect yourself, then be wary. But of course, as people know, romance scams and other scams like this can still happen with people you meet in person. So be vigilant, but also keep an eye out for people that you know that might be vulnerable, because these people do target vulnerable groups. And as I mentioned earlier, particularly their group between 65 and 74, which unfortunately will be people who are probably lonely as well. They target those people and they are likely to lose more of the money. And also don't forget that that is probably some of those people's life savings as well. So we're keeping it quite tight this week. So moving swiftly on then, Andy, onto your piece relating to the security of banking apps.
Yeah, so I'm going to do a quick piece on how safe online banking is, and also reveal which banks have the best online and app security. And I'll finish the piece with a few tips for those who want to make sure that they can stay safe when banking online. So firstly, I want to credit Which, the consumer magazine that pulled together some research and insight into a number of banks and ended up ranking those banks using a number of security criteria. And so I thought it was interesting to reveal what sort of security criteria they were looking at, what banks use in terms of making sure that their customers are safe, and also revealed 10 of the banks ranked best to worst in terms of online security. So of course, when they conducted this research, they could only test certain criteria. They weren't, for example, able to see the back-end processes that were on the side of the banks. They were only able to test what they could access from their side. So the four main criteria they looked at was encryption. They also tested logins. They also tested account management and how safe that was, and also the navigation of the online apps and web apps, and also how safe the logout process is. And so just digging down into a little bit more of the detail in terms of what that means, they're looking for strong customer authentication. And what that means, when you log into your online banking and you use a card to pay online, for example, you'll probably notice that there's additional checks from time to time from your bank. You may have to put in passcodes, you may have to put in your thumbprint, you may get sent text messages. So strong customer authentication, or SCA, is what they were looking for, usually involves multiple identification checks to ensure that that transaction is secure. Another one of the key criteria that they were looking for is confirmation of payee, or COP, and that helps prevent payments being made to the wrong bank accounts. So what it does is it actually checks the name of the payee against the account details provided and alerts if they don't match. Now that might seem like a simple check and you would think that was a prerequisite for sending payments, but actually not all banks offer it. And while the 6 largest banking groups were forced to introduce it in 2020, others have been slow or have been just gradually introducing it into their processes. So that's one of the key things that they were looking at as well. They were also looking into IP addresses, making sure that they were secure. Security headers, which help to protect against a range of cyber attacks by telling your browser to behave in a certain way when it's communicating with the bank's website. And they're also looking at something called transport layer security, TLS, which is like a digital stamp of approval and ensures that the communication between you and your bank is scrambled to make sure that no one can intercept that. And so when the numbers were crunched, it came up with a list of the top banks for online banking security, with the top bank scoring 82% and the bottom bank scoring 52%. I'll read you through the top 10 and I will share with you the article so you can look further into the insight and analysis that they did. So Starling was top, HSBC next, then NatWest, Lloyds, First Direct, Barclays, Santander, Cooperative Bank, TSB, Nationwide, and Virgin Money at the bottom on 52%. Starling scored a pretty impressive 82%. So obviously that doesn't cover all the banks, but it's pretty much most of the major providers, and no doubt many listeners will be banking with one of those. And so obviously that insight is interesting. It shows you how secure your bank or online banking is. But I also wanted to share some information on how you, the individual, can make sure that you try and stay as safe as possible when banking online. And so the first thing I just wanted to remind people if they bank online is most banking apps these days allow you to instantly freeze your debit or credit card. So if you've lost your card or if it's been stolen, make sure that you head into your app as soon as possible and click the button that allows you to freeze that card, because that is likely to be far, far quicker than trying to contact your bank via phone. Another thing that we can all do straight away is block certain payment types. So if you're someone that doesn't ever purchase anything outside of the UK, or you're not interested in gambling, for example, there are 2 types of transaction that you can actually ban and block via most banking apps. So make sure that you do that, just to ensure that if your details do come into the wrong hands, those 2 types of transactions will definitely be rejected before they have any chance of going through. Another thing you can do is set notifications within your app, and you can set real-time notifications, which mean that you'll get an alert every time something goes through your account, and it makes things much, much easier to spot if you've got those notifications on. In addition to that, you could consider linking your banking app to one of the budgeting apps out there. And a budgeting app will be able to collate all of the information from a number of banks, if you bank with a number of banks, credit cards, for example, even your pension and things like that, and put it all in one place. And by just checking that one app, you will be able to see everything that's going through. And again, that could help you to easily spot something before it becomes a major problem. And just a few extra tips at the end to make sure that you're making it as difficult as possible for unscrupulous people to get hold of your details. Don't click on any links that come in emails or text or WhatsApp. It's very easy for scammers to impersonate banks or other firms, and via those links it's very easy for them to steal your data. Make sure that when your phone's due a software upgrade that you do that, because often software upgrades include the latest security software. Consider also additional antivirus software if you bank online using your computer. And if you use your phone to bank online, then make sure that you go into the settings so that your phone auto locks after a short period, meaning you'll need to put in a code or your thumbprint or your retina scanning, and also disable on-screen notifications, because if a scammer gets hold of your phone, and even if they can't get into your phone, if they're able to see an on-screen notification, let's say it's a one-time passcode, then they're going to be able to use that to access your financial information. So don't allow on-screen notifications. A really good tip here is to just check your privacy settings and data that you share on social media. Make sure that it's locked down, friends only, etc. And make sure that you don't reveal any sensitive information like your address, your phone number, email, date of birth, mother's maiden name. All of that information can be used by criminals to steal your identity. And it goes without saying, don't accept any friend requests from people that you don't know. Another one is to make sure that your home router has a secure password. For example, replace any default passwords that come with that, because by leaving it as it is, it does leave you open to people being able to access your personal information through your home router. The same goes for unsecured wireless networks or public computers. If you can, use a virtual private network, a VPN, which will hide all of the sensitive information and make sure that scammers can't get hold of your details. And just finally, the last one, if you get a call from your bank out of the blue, make sure that you very politely, because it may well be genuine, end the call and say that you will call them, and then make sure that you call the bank personally from the number on any letters you may have at home or on the back of your bank card. Also make sure that from the phone call that you received that you've disconnected that call, because there is a way that scammers can actually stay on the line if you don't disconnect that call correctly. So there's just a few tips there on how you can stay safe online. Again, I've read out the best and worst of the banks for online security, and as I said earlier, I'll share the article with the full details within the podcast notes. Damien, we're done for this week, so all that's left to say is the usual stuff that we should say at the start, which is please do review the podcast. And if you email lauren@moneytothemasses.com and you've done that, you can actually claim that, and we will send you out a Money to the Masses mug to say thank you.
Yeah, and we've done that this week, in fact. So last week we read out a few reviews, people got in touch, and there'll be mugs going out to them ASAP.
So there you go. You could be a Money to the Masses mug holder. I mean, some would call it bribery. We just call it being generous.
Yeah, generous to a fault. One quick point, linking all the way back to the AI I mentioned at the start of this show. For those of you who have found us in the past and you've become part of the community and you love listening to the podcast or using the website, please do make sure that you tell other people about it. Because the reason I say that is obviously if you'd watched any of the stuff to do with Google and things like that in the future, we're likely to have a lot of these people out there trying to take over the internet with things that don't allow people to find great shows, great sites like ours and like the millions of others out there in the way that they do now. So if you find what we do entertaining, useful, please tell people about it and help us spread the word about Money to the Masses. So that is it for this week, Andy. And all I'm going to say is until next time.
Until next time.